Okay, so the planning system and the building regulations are separate and different. They don't talk to each other, and it's like your car tax and your car insurance. You need them both, but they do not do the same thing. So that's planning system looks at your house from the outside in. What impact will this thing have on your wider neighborhood for parking, gas, water, electric, and sewage, and the look and feel of the building? They don't care about insulation. They don't care about structure. That's not their thing. The building regulations do not care what your house looks like or whether your extension is in keeping. They're not interested in that. They think of things like accessibility, daylighting, ventilation, structure, electrics, heating, the practical, technical things, generally speaking. In a broad, simple statement, that is the difference between these two systems. They're separate, they're different, they don't talk to each other, but you do need them both. You cannot say that one is more important than the other.
This episode of Behind the Regs is sponsored by Plan Checker. Plan Checker is a UK-based digital platform designed to connect clients with verified building control and construction professionals, making it easier to find the right expertise at the right time for the right job. It doesn't replace building control bodies, and it doesn't carry out restricted activities or function. It simply creates clearer, more transparent access to the professionals working across the industry. If you're a professional, a client, or part of the wider built environment sector, you can learn more or sign up at planchecker.co.uk.
Welcome back to Behind the Regs. I'm Jack.
And I'm Nader.
Today's episode is slightly different because we're stepping outside our usual building control bubble and looking at the wider picture of homeowners, architects, designers, and building control professionals and how they all interact throughout a project.
And that's important because if we're honest, most people don't wake up in the morning thinking they're going to learn about building regulations or building control. Most people first encounter with the system because they are extending their house or converting a loft or building a garden room or buying a property.
Exactly. For many people, it's probably one of the biggest investments they'll ever make, yet the process itself can often feel quite confusing. Plan permission, building regulations, architects, structural engineers, surveyors, building control, there's a lot to navigate.
Yeah, and one of the things we've realized through the podcast is that different professions often see different parts of the same project. As building control professionals, we see one side of it, architects see another, surveyors see another, and homeowners often sit in the middle trying to make sense of all of it.
Which is why we're really looking forward to today's conversation. Our guest has spent years helping people understand construction, design, and regulation in a practical way, translating technical information into something that everyday homeowners can actually understand.
Hey, brilliant. Níall, would you like to give us a brief about yourself, how you started, and just for people to know who you are and
Thank you.
Get to know you a bit more.
Yeah, no problem. So thank you for having me on the podcast, guys. I really appreciate it. My name is Níall and I am an architect. I'm originally from Ireland, but I studied architecture at the University of Dundee, graduated in 2004 and moved to Edinburgh. And after a few years there, I set up my own practice in 2009 and specializing in renovations, extensions to private homes. That's been the bulk of my work throughout my career. I have done a small number of commercial projects here and there or worked with a couple of developers, but the vast majority of my clients are just regular homeowners who want to get a bit more space. And over the time that I've been doing this, I've learned how to explain the system to people who have no experience of the system. And in 2001, just during COVID and the aftermath of COVID, I started making videos on YouTube. And I was initially just talking about my own career, my own experience of profession of architecture, but I kept being asked questions in the comments. People were saying, I've got a house in London or Cardiff or Birmingham, and I want to extend it. Will I get planning permission? How much will it cost? How long will it take? How do I find a builder? All of these sorts of questions. And I initially was very cautious about answering those questions because a lot of liability attaches to giving information to people if you're a professional. But I decided that there's probably a business in this. So I set up a website called Real Life Architecture, and people started booking consultations with me through that. It's a paid for service, but it's been very good. I've been able to help hundreds of people over the years in giving them advice. And the most popular form of consultation on there is for people looking for advice before they buy a property. Most people who go out to buy a house, they'll talk to a mortgage advisor, they'll talk to a surveyor, they'll talk to a lawyer. but very few people would ever think to ask an architect. And the UK sells about 1 million homes a year, of which only 200,000 are new build. So that leaves 800,000 older properties, and those are the ones with the problems. So I find myself talking to people who have found a house that's in the right area, but it's not big enough, at which point they need to know, can they extend? Can they build an extension, convert the garage, convert the loft, alter the internal layout? And a big part of that is obviously dealing with the building regulations. So this has been teaching people about this, even the fact that it exists. Some people don't know that the building regulations are a separate thing from the planning system. So that's been my journey, is going from just a one-man band architect, I work on my own, to having a sort of UK-wide audience of over 100,000 subscribers across YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram, and doing online consultations has now become a significant part of my business. So that's me.
So creating real-life architecture with building this significant audience, what made you decide to start sharing professional advice publicly rather than keeping it within the traditional realms?
That's a good question. I think it's just to show that I have the knowledge. If you're on social media and you want people to believe what you're saying, you have to have some sort of demonstration. You have to be able to show people that you do know what you're talking about. And you would think house extensions and attic conversions and loft extensions, etc., or renovations of older buildings would be kind of boring, but no two are the same. No two buildings are the same. No two clients are the same. No two budgets are the same. So there's always something different to talk about. So I start making content about methods of construction costs, the planning system, the building regulations. There's just an endless list of things you could be talking about. I've been doing this for, 5 years, and I still have an enormous list of topics I have yet to cover. So I share my expertise, and people respond to that, and I regularly get told during consultations or in the comments that, they like the fact that I appear to be knowledgeable, and then they book the consultations. So it's to answer your question, it's about demonstrating competence. So to show that I know what I'm talking about. And I will admit in videos and anywhere else, there are things that I'm yet to learn. And there have been videos I've made, some of them very popular videos, where I showed that I used to do something one way, but now I've learned a better way of doing it, and take people on that journey.
Yeah, which is a really good way to build confidence for potential clients, isn't it? With your viewers and predominantly homeowners, or like you mentioned before, some people that may be buying a property and considering what they can do with that, where would they first start when they may not have the experience? Is it a case of maybe doing a bit of online research, or do you think
so?
People are still a bit confused of where do they start? Where do they begin? How does it all come about?
So I always ask people in my online consultations, and I'm doing like 2 or 3 a week. I think I did 5 this week. So I always ask at the end, where did you first find real life architecture? How did you encounter me? And 90% of them, it's on YouTube. A few will say TikTok. Very few say Instagram. My wife says I'm not using Instagram properly, so maybe I need to spend a bit more time on that one. But increasingly, the web itself, Google searching and AI searching is creeping in there quite a bit. Over the last 6 months, a lot of people have been telling me they're finding my service via the various AIs that are out there. So people go online, it seems to me, and they start trying to find answers to their questions, and they quickly run into either an absence of the information. It's simply not there. There's nobody providing that information, or there's contradictory information. I get it with house extension costs. I get people telling me, I found this person who says a house extension costs this much per square meter, and then someone else says it costs a very different figure per square meter. Who's right? So finding someone who can give you answers or point you in the right direction and give you clarity. If you're a regular person who's never hired an architect, never set foot on a building site, that's difficult. And so I'm trying to fill that gap in the market with the service that I offer. And I like I said, I don't always know the answer. I will often recommend that people talk to other experts, whether it's a lawyer or a surveyor, or, there are other people in the industry, this, who have their own niche expertise. And I will point out to them, you need to be talking to these people as well as to me.
So Neil, do you really think that people are genuinely better informed today than they were maybe, let's say, 10 or 15 years ago? Or do they simply have access to more information? Maybe, let's say, some good
There's
and
too
some
much
not so
information.
good. Too much information.
That's a really good question. I suspect, on balance, probably yes, people have more information, but the problem they've got is deciphering whether it applies to them or is it relevant. But there are still gaps. There are still large aspects of how you go about doing work to your home that it just isn't out there. The information is not available. Construction costs are a good example of this. There's no really centrally organized, accurate database that will tell you precisely how much it costs to build a house or build an extension or build a loft conversion. There's just a lot of people documenting their experience and a lot of builders spewing numbers that are just very widely ranged. So I think people have access to more information. With the arrival of AI, they've got a way of sort of filtering that information, but like AI doesn't know or understand these things. It's drawing from other sources. So it too will fall foul of the same problems. If the information isn't there or it's simply too diverse, they're not going to be able to make sense of it. So they need someone who does this. And the real life architecture is one half of my business. I have two separate companies. One is real life architecture, the other is my practice. And I regularly find myself sharing my own projects, both in my videos, but also in consultations. I'll pull up drawings and pictures to show people, here's a job I'm doing in Edinburgh or have done in the last, say, year or so that's similar to what you're thinking of doing. And here's what it actually costs. And I can talk them through the drawings, talk them through the photographs during construction and show, this is what we did. Here is what it cost. And we tendered it to 3 different builders and we got our prices and we went with this guy and this is what it cost. This is reality. It's very hard to argue against that. If you've got somebody on there saying, no, it shouldn't cost as much as this. And I can pull up drawings and photographs and construction costed documents and say, that's one I built similar to what you're doing and it cost X. Your job will likely cost X as well.
So if someone is starting a home project tomorrow, what do you think is the single most important thing they should understand before spending any money?
The first thing I'm going to say is talk to an architect.
Well, that's an obvious one, but not many people do that.
Yeah, no, it doesn't have to be me, but find an architect who is in your locality who does this kind of work. And it's not that architects rarely formally specialize the way the doctors do, where you get doctors who are specialists in cancer or specialists in orthopedics or whatever it might be. And there are a limited number of specialisms within architecture, like conservation architecture is a recognized specialism, sustainability is a recognized specialism, but not many. What you'll find is informal specialization. So if you know someone from, say, down the pub or one of the other parents at your kid's school who happens to be an architect, don't necessarily assume they're going to have the same experience that's relevant to your project. They could be doing, office blocks and airports and Olympic stadia. They may never have done a house extension. So you need to find an architect who has done this kind of work and does it all the time. So once you have that, you then they will have a network. They will know all the builders in the area who do this kind of work. They'll know the engineers. They'll know the other people, the suppliers like kitchens and bathroom suppliers. They know all these people. They can assemble a team for you and help you answer the questions. So that I would say is the best first step a homeowner can make in the UK is find a local architect with the relevant experience in doing the kind of job that you're wanting to do.
Well, I'm going to move now to one of my best topics, planning permission versus building regulations.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the biggest misconceptions we encounter is the belief that a planning approval means a project complies with the building regulations. That's what people think. Everyone says, I can start, I've got a planning permission. How often do you see that misunderstanding?
All the time. Yeah, I have lost count. I've stopped counting. It's I think in the UK, the media has a lot to answer for. In that they fixate on planning. Every day you'll find stories in the media of someone who either built something without planning permission or someone who got planning permission and the consensus is they probably shouldn't have got planning permission. Whatever it is, the planning system is an endless source of news, but you almost never hear about building regulations. The only recent exception to that was Grenfell, where the journalist understood
I'm going to time you now. I'm going to time you. So if you had 60 seconds to explain the difference between planning permission and building regulation to a homeowner, how would you do it? You've got 60 seconds to do that.
Okay, so the planning system and the building regulations are separate and different. They don't talk to each other. And it's like your car tax and your car insurance. You need them both, but they do not do the same thing. So that's the planning system. Looks at your house from the outside in. What impact will this thing have on your wider neighborhood for parking, gas, water, electric, and sewage, and the look and feel of the building? They don't care about insulation. They don't care about structure. That's not their thing. The building regulations do not care what your house looks like or whether your extension is in keeping. They're not interested in that. They think of things like accessibility, daylighting, ventilation, structure, electrics, heating, the practical, technical things. generally speaking. In a broad, simple statement, that is the difference between these two systems. They're separate, they're different, they don't talk to each other, but you do need them both. You cannot say that one is more important than the other.
That's very good, Neil. Very, very good. That's
You can
about,
tell I've done this before.
yeah, that's about 55 seconds. I was looking at the count. That's really, really, really good. And I think a lot of people will find this very, very insightful in such a short time, like in less than a minute. Another question for you. What are the common questions that immediately tell you somebody is confusing the two systems together?
Yeah, it's like you said, they'll say that they've got planning and they started construction, and now why are things going wrong? Or they'll start saying the planning officer told them to put a certain amount of insulation into a building. They start muddling the two. It's a classic example of an amateur or a first time person getting into the system, and they don't know what they're talking about. When they start muddling the distinction between the two, and they start saying that the person from the council told me to do this, the planning officer told me to put in more insulation, or something like that, is usually where I need to sit down and say to them, okay, you need to really be clear in your mind. There's a massive distinction between these two separate things. And at that point, they made the penny drops. And there's two separate applications going on here, and you need them both.
Have you ever experienced any situations where planning permission's been obtained, but then there's been significant design changes which were required to satisfy the building regulations?
Yeah, again, yes. And now I'll hold my hand up and say I've had this happen for my own project. So I'm not trying to point fingers and say that, yeah, it's only something that an ill-informed or amateur or first-timer would do. The building regulations are complex. And so the classic scenario, if you're designing anything, whether it's a house extension or an airport or anything in between, usually the first thing you have to go through is the planning system. Because in the UK, the planning system is unknowable. It's like a black box. You cannot predict if you're going to get your planning. So because of that, you are best advised to do this first. There's nothing in the rules that say you have to do it that way. You could apply for your building regulations first or apply for them both at the same time. Nobody will stop you. But generally speaking, you design the building. The first hurdle to clear is planning. But, and this is the important bit, a competent designer who is producing this design for whatever it is you're building will have an eye on the building regulations. They will understand that the building regulations set limits on, say, the amount of glazing you can have in your house extension. There's an upper and lower limit for these things. There are choices to be made. You don't have to explain that in the planning application process, but if you put in a window that's too big or too small later on, after you've got planning, you're then going to have to change that design. So the danger is you could wind up going through planning, getting approval, and then trying to clear the building regulations hurdle and significantly changing the appearance of this building such that the thing you wind up building bears no relation to what you got approval for back in the planning stage. So a competent designer should be able to hold both of these things in their mind at the same time. Go through planning first, but then because you've tested it, that the design will comply with the regs when you eventually have to get through that, and you don't wind up changing the design. But it's complex, and like I said, I've had to change designs to comply with building regulations laterally, and it's it has happened a couple of times. You then go back and you try and amend the planning system. I've never had a major change to it, but relatively minor things. But again, you have to be careful of how you balance these two systems, because nobody in the planning department will tell you, yeah, by the way, you put too much glass in this thing, because that's not their job. That happens later on.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a question, but I think we all really know the answer to this one. Do you think enough is being done to explain the distinction between the two systems?
No, I don't. The government, the media, there's nobody out there. And even my own professional bodies like the Royal Institute of British Architects, who do a lot of good and engage with the public, pretty regularly, and also they engage with politicians. There's no real attempt to try and talk to the average person. We've got, I think it's 26 million homeowners in the UK, something like that. It's difficult to get figures on it, but it's around that amount. There's no public outreach. There's no regular engagement, which is why I found a gap in the market. And I've started doing this. I didn't expect to build a business on it, but it turns out there's a lot of regular people out there who don't have this information. They need the information. And once I started providing it, they're willing to pay to get that information. So I think there's room for some or many of our professional bodies to try to create some form of public engagement where they, try and explain how this system works to the average person.
So for our listeners who could be listening to this podcast, hopefully some homeowners will be interested in this one, as this will be very beneficial. What practical advice would you give someone listening before submitting either application for planning and for building control? Is there anything you'd say that they should be doing?
I mean, when you say submitting it, I'm going to go ahead and assume they've hired a competent professional to prepare the design and do the application on their behalf. That said, the planning system is set up so that the average person could make what's called a competent application. That is, you can fill in the form, pay the correct fee, and put in the right number and type of drawings. And it's fairly basic for a planning application. The system encourages regular people to engage with planning, which you can argue is a good or a bad thing. But it absolutely does not work that way for building regulations. Like the building regulations the documents are hundreds of pages long. They're complex. They're regularly updated. They're not internally referential. They don't tell you that now you need to turn to page 410 to read something else. You need to have read it and understood it as a competent professional. And even competent professionals can get it wrong and misunderstand things. So if you're the first piece of advice is go and hire someone who does this all the time. Do not attempt to do this yourself. Even though the planning system might encourage you to do this yourself, you'll fall foul of what we've mentioned earlier. You might design it and get it through the planning system yourself and think, brilliant. Then you try and clear the building regs hurdle and discover that you have completely misunderstood how this system works. And you're going to have to go back to basics and redesign the thing to comply with the building regs and then go through planning all over again because the design is significantly different.
So the key takeaway,
hire a professional.
Yeah. I think just to clarify as well for listeners is that yes, you can submit a planning application on your own, but a householder application is the one that you can submit on your own. The full planning application is a quite complex.
Yes, that's true.
A lot more questions in there. And that is like definitely you need to hire a competent architect to help you submit
it has become more complex over the last 10, 15 years, the planning system, in that I'm old enough now to remember how it was when I started, and you could just negotiate. And even if we're doing, say, a one-off house, a self-build one-off house, which is many people's dream to do, the planning system was relatively forgiving, in terms of the number and type of documents you were required. Now you need all kinds of specialist consultations for trees,
biodiversity, net gain, and all of these things.
I mean, I've been at this, and I'm looking at it thinking, oh man, I mean, I have now had to spread my net wider with professionals to find other people who do these sorts of things, and it's very complex. But you're right, the homeowner application process is for things like house extensions.
Yes,
that's
the simpler. That's the simpler one.
It is simpler. Yes,
the full planning application is quite.
It has become a lot more complex.
Yeah. Thank you, Nick.
So where building control fits into the process, I think this is an open question for us all to sort of jump in. When should a homeowner first start thinking about engaging with building regulations and speaking to a building control body, such as a local authority or a registered building control approver? Obviously, within Scotland, where you do majority of your works there, that's a different format as well, isn't it? It's all local authority driven in Scotland. So there's a bit of a choice difference for likes of England, where myself and Nader work. So Nader, do you want to jump in and give your thoughts on that as well?
From our perspective, I think we'd always rather be involved earlier than later. Like people should, because I know, because I come from an architectural background, and I know that in the past, like when you get a planning permission, on the decision letter, it tells you right at the end of it that you need to engage building control now. It does tell you that, by the way. And if people read that decision letter all the way to the end, the answer is right there. But yeah, saying people to engage with us quite early is a double-edged sword, though, because engaging with us quite early means that they need to submit a building control application, because that's when the process starts. But if they just want a simple building regulation advice, which we're not able to give because it's outside our remit, that's when they need someone like yourself, Neil. So do you find that homeowners often leave building control engagement too late?
They're not thinking about it. That's the truth. I mean, I've met a few clients who understood that there was a second process called building regulations approval, or the building warrant in Scotland. But the vast majority of people don't know it exists, or they're not entirely clear what it is and why it exists. And it's down to me and other competent professionals to understand the sequence of events. And I make a big effort in my practice, and always have, to try and explain the various stages that the job goes through. The Royal Institute of British Architects has a plan of work. There's 8 stages in there, showing from the very beginning, the first conversation, through to post-occupancy and every stage in between. So it tries to break a project, whether big or small, into stages. I break my projects into 6 stages for clients. One of those is distinctly the building regulations approval stage. I've got a flow chart in a document that I can give to every client to say, these are the choices we have to make. This is when the building regulations comes into it. And for my projects, I would always have a structural engineer at the building regulations stage. And that's just something that the council are going to ask for the local authority, or in England, the verifiers you need a structural engineer's input at that point. So yeah, building regulations is a distinct stage, but you do need to think about it as early as possible. So there's a good example is if you're extending a house, and the clients will always tell me, I want as much glass as possible. I want to absolutely maximize the amount of glass in my extension.
I spoke about that earlier too.
Yeah. And this question comes up all the time. And you think, fine, okay, but we have two options here. Option A, you can have all the glass you want, as long as your extension is less than 50 square meters and it's isolated from the house, that there's a door between it and the house. And that's how conservatories and orangeries, etc. That's what they're dealt with.
It's an exempt extension. Yes. Okay, yeah. That's correct.
Second option, you can have the extension can be open with the house. You can walk from the house to the extension, no doors, but there's a limit on the amount of glass you can have. And that has its own complexities in it. At which point that conversation has to happen right at the very beginning. I would say the very first conversation that I have with my clients, if we're talking about an extension, we need to make this choice. And most of them will go, oh, okay, I understand. And then I would demonstrate to them, I would do some quick calculations, how much glass we can get, within that, and what that might look like. And we have back and forth on that. So that's right there at the first conversation, and the first set of drawings, which would just be feasibility study drawings. The building regulations are playing into it.
How many times have you had issues with clients believing that they don't need building regulations because what they're doing is under permitted development, and they believe that permitted development means it's uncontrollable from every angle?
Yeah, I think that we should be giving some sort of public service announcement, or sort of public warning to people. If anyone tells you there's something is exempt, be really, really careful. Who is telling you this, and why, and have they a vested interest? If it's a builder telling a homeowner, oh, you don't need X, Y, or Z approval, it's not up to the builder to make that decision. It's usually the local authority, whether it's the planning system or building regulations. So if there's a homeowner listening who's been told that something they're doing is exempt, who is telling them that? And if that person is not the local authority, planning system, or building regulations, or one of you guys who's a verifier, go and get that from the horse's mouth. Find definitive information from the person who is lawfully authorized to make that decision. So the planning system, the introduction of permitted development, which was in 2015, it set people's hair on fire. They thought, oh man, this is amazing. I can get my extension and never need to deal with the planning system. And what actually happened after that is that the mortgage industry caught up with this. And now if you look at any of the major mortgage lenders' websites, they'll all have this thing about permitted development and say, well, actually, yes, you can build an extension with permitted development, but we need you to show us a thing called a certificate of lawful use that proves that you have permitted development. Yes. And the local authority will not tell them that, because the whole point of permitted development was to take planning applications away from the local authority to free them up. And they didn't want to be dealing with documentation and having to issue you with any kind of approvals. You just went and you assessed the rules, and then you built your thing without ever having contacted the planning department. But the mortgage industry now wants evidence that this was done correctly so that they can secure lending against your property. And it's catching people out. For exemptions in the building regulations, they're different in Scotland as they are in England, but the exemptions are tiny. Like there aren't many. They're very limited in scope. And if anyone is telling you you're getting an exemption, as a homeowner, you should be double checking this yourself and get it in writing from your local authority that what you're proposing to do is in fact actually exempt, because the fallout from this could be catastrophic financially. If you build something, you've paid large sums of money for it to be built, only then you try to sell it and find out at that point this has not been done properly. And I see it in my online consultations. And I've talked my clients in the consultations out of buying properties because I can see in the estate agent's photographs that what has been built could not possibly comply with regulations, like having kitchens in conservatories. You cannot do that. But it's there. The estate agent's photographed it. The estate agents don't understand what they're looking at.
Of course.
And at this point in time, I'm saying to them that's wrong. That should never have been built. It's not possible to get approval for it. So either get the current owner to fix it or walk away from this purchase.
This episode is sponsored by Plan Checker. Across building control and the wider construction sector, one issue keeps coming up: capacity. The work is there, the responsibility is huge, and the pressure keeps increasing. Plan Checker was built to help bridge that gap by making it easier to access independent, appropriately qualified professionals when support is genuinely needed. Whether that's for plan reviews, consultancy input, or specialist advice. It doesn't change statutory responsibility, and it doesn't interfere with regulatory rules. It simply helps people find expertise without relying on informal networks or last-minute phone calls. If you want to see how that works in practice, visit planchecker.co.uk. There's a lot of things I see on listings pictures that I say to myself, how did that have, or did this really have a building control application in place? You see things like, yes, like what you just said now, a conservatory that they've removed the door between the conservatory and the kitchen. They don't realize that now that has become a space within the thermal envelope of the
hemorrhaging heat.
Exactly. And then you see things like staircases with open risers.
Yeah.
Things, very little
no handrails, no balusters. Yeah.
No balusters, no handrails. You see like the ballast, no, not the balusters. You see like not horizontal rails, which, and you see gaps that are more than 100 mil, so a child can, put their head between the balusters. Things like that. It's for me. I would make it a bit easier for people listening to us today. If you think your building is exempt under building regulations, then I think the easiest thing to do, type building regulations 2010 on Google, go on Schedule 2 and look at Class 6 and Class 7. Class 6 is the small detached buildings and Class 7 is extensions, and it will give you the parameters that will make that building or structure or extension exempt.
And in Scotland, it's Section 0. There's a table that lists things that are exempt in there. And for example, you can build an ensuite bathroom without need of building regs approval in Scotland.
So what can happen when people wrongly assume building regulations don't apply?
So the consequences often will go unnoticed for years. Let's say you own a house, you carry out some construction work in the house, and the builder assured you, don't worry, it's all exempt, we'll just crack on and build it. You paid the builder, you're happy with the project, and then a few years go by and you decide one of two things. Either there's a catastrophic event like a flood or a fire, and you now need to get your insurance, your home insurance, to pay for this, and it's a lot of money. They send a loss adjuster to the house, and the loss adjuster goes, wait a second, you've made unauthorized alterations to your home, we're not paying. The other thing is they are putting the house on the market, and this is the one I see all the time, and most potential buyers will need a mortgage, at which point you have surveyors getting involved, or someone like me who's advising a potential buyer, and I'm looking at this and going, there's no way this is correct. And then we start digging further and further. And the one thing for homeowners to note is that the Building Act, the piece of legislation that creates the building regulations, places sole requirement for compliance on the building owner. So the moment someone purchases a house, they are fully legally responsible for all of the things that have been done in that house, even if it was a previous owner who did it. So that creates an enormous, potential legal hazard for someone buying a home. If they are buying a home and it hasn't been done properly, then the moment they buy the house, that's their problem. It's not the previous owner that they bought it off. They can't be sued, apparently. So again, we're straying into a legal area here, but I understand from the Heron Court legal judgment that the High Court handed down a few years back that described the role of the verifier and who was liable, and the role of the owner and the extent of their liability, which is pretty much the entire liability for compliance.
Sorry, Neil, before we move into the next section of. You've used the word verifier a lot. Is that the common word used in Scotland?
Yes, verifier is used in the Building Scotland Act 2004. The word, I'm pretty sure it is verifier. Yeah.
Okay, right.
Is that, just correct me if I'm wrong, is that also the word that's used in England in the Building Act?
We're not verifiers, no.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So we're registered building inspectors. The places where we work are building control bodies, which will be your local authority, and then your registered building control approvers, which was formerly known as approved inspectors.
Yeah. Okay.
So a couple of changes from the Building Safety Act for the private sector, a different name, probably the longest one you could ever think of, but that's what we are, or the companies we work for. I do at the minute. Nader, your local authority currently, aren't you?
Yes.
So that's the distinction between Scotland and England, in that we've touched on this before. In Scotland, if you're getting a building regs approval, it must go through the local authority. In England, and I think in Wales, you can go to your local authority, but there's also a private sector option on that. And I'm curious to know, at what point would, say, the typical homeowner have to make a choice, or is there a choice? How does that work? Or does it depend on what area they happen to be in? Are some local authorities, better equipped to deal with it, or are other areas just regularly using private?
That's the Scotland versus England.
Yeah.
Jack,
For that, I'd say the choice, it can depend on your contractor. Your principal contractor may work with a registered building control approver and has done for a number of years. They have a good working relationship. They understand how they work, or they may always work with the local authority, again, because they know how they work. They get on with that person and it's just what they've always done. Again, could be dictated on your architect. Your architect might say, get some quotes from your local authority or a couple different registered building control approvers just to see what the value is. Personally, it's a difficult one to say who would be better for what type of project. It all comes down to how many registered building inspectors they have and at what competency levels they are. So on the Gov website, you can find the registered building inspector, or you could look at a building control body. So, for example, if someone wanted to do a domestic extension, they could look on their local authority website and put in the name of that local authority and check how many registered building inspectors they have to that competency level. Same with the private sector. If they want to look at registered building control approver, they can see if they're doing flats. Okay, I know that they've got at least 3 registered building inspectors that are registered for 2A and B, and B would cover flats up to 11 metres. And that could sort of distinguish of what decision you'd make on who you'd like to commission to work with on your projects, because you wouldn't want to go for, say, a local authority that doesn't have someone registered to conduct those works and review it. Otherwise, there's no one competent to check it, and vice versa with the private registered building control approver side. You want to make sure that where you go, there's going to be someone that can actually do that role of an RBI.
Basically, people in England have a choice, Neil. They either go with the local authority or go with the registered building control approval. But our understanding, obviously, is that in Scotland, that's not the case. In Scotland, you've only got...
That's correct. And
one option.
Where we've had issues with building control is staffing and timescales, because a lot of local authorities, not just building control, also the planning departments, have had massive churn and turnover over the last, say, since COVID, particularly. And some local authorities that I have had dealings with outsource the building regulations application. So I will register it. There's a Scottish government online portal where I would lodge all my planning and building regs applications, and it gets sent, at least notionally, to the relevant local authority for building regs approval. They then, behind the scenes, will send this away to other places, often to more remote, out of the way councils at the other end of the country, who then assess it and then write back to me. And then I get this back, and it's from, I do an application in one local authority, and it comes back from Argyll and Bute, which is a very scenic place on the west coast of Scotland,
Okay.
100 miles away from where the building is. And so that officer will never visit the site. They've never been to the site. And I'm looking at this going, what's going on here? And it's being done for staffing levels. So there's been a discussion in Scotland over many years as to whether we should adopt a system similar to how you guys have down south, where we can have private verifiers. or building control inspectors who might the client would pay, and those people would be registered and authorized to do certain kinds of work, whether it be domestic extensions or bigger projects like you've mentioned.
To
But
be
so
fair,
far, there's no moves to bring that in up here. It's entirely public sector.
What you just said now, that same model exists here as well, with partnering authorities in England, which sometimes you can get the plans checked by different authority than the authority that is actually going out doing the inspections. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jack. That's correct. Yeah, that's like the partnering authorities model here in England. That's the same?
Yeah, I believe it was I think it's the LEC partnership scheme. So if
Yeah,
you are a
yes.
partner member, you could say a contractor has worked with St. Helens Council and they have a new build housing project in Sefton. They could go to St. Helens Council and go, can you plan check our project? And Sefton will work with St. Helens as an example. Sefton would then conduct the site inspections and the plan check would be produced by St. Helens. So they'd partner together to achieve the goal.
I think the question would be for you, Neil, what aspects of the Scottish system work particularly well for you?
So this doesn't always work, but we find it quite useful professionally, is that in Scotland, you cannot legally start construction until your building regulations approval has been granted. That's not to say that people adhere to that, but this is how our system's supposed to work. So when it was working, pretty well, we could have reassurance that a competent body had assessed the design. We'd spend time going back and forth. Questions would be asked between myself, the engineer, and the local authority building standards officer, and we would refine the design, get it to comply, and at that point, then we could proceed with construction. I gather down south, you have a different system again. You can do a notice as opposed to full approval.
Yes,
and it's something some of us up here again, people have thought about bringing that in, and it's been resisted up here by professionals and contractors. But I can see why some people might want to do it. Do you want to tell me a bit more about how the distinction operates down south?
I'm not a massive fan of building notices.
me neither.
You submit
For
your
that
building
reason, in that you could build something that does not comply and then have to undo it.
It's not. No. No, it's not. It's not that. No, I don't think it's that, Jack.
You don't get any information. You'll likely get maybe a location plan. You don't get any information. It's
Yes.
You submit it, and from 48 hours of submission, you can start works. If you send a notification that works will begin within 48 hours. There's no information. You go in there blind. It's hard to make an assessment as a registered building inspector on the fly, because there could be lots of different things, and you've got the pressure of people, contractors, clients wanting things answered immediately. But we've got lots of things to consider. If you're building a new house, a building notice isn't for it. I think it gets overly used where it should maybe be used for like a simple steel, a knock through, a simple steel.
Even
Joining two rooms together in your house, something like that.
Even though at that point you still need a structural design and calculations for it. Even at that point, I think for me, building notices is quite contradictory to what we do as registered building inspectors, because people are expecting us to give them that design advice on site, to tell them what thickness of insulation to put here, and
they're all set to order that material there and then, so it's a lot of pressure on you guys.
And that's not our role. So it is very contradictory to what we do, and I think it doesn't have a place now in the regulatory system.
My experience,
building notice.
My experience of it is that because I work in Edinburgh has it's quite an international city, and it's got a lot of finance, a lot of large financial companies work there, and a lot of people from London move up to live and work in Edinburgh in the finance sector. And so I've had lots of clients over the years who've had some experience of construction in England, and then they try and do something to a property that got in Edinburgh, and they start expressing frustration of, why can't we just begin with a notice? Why can't we just tell the local authority that we're starting and we'll deal with all that stuff as we go? And I have to explain to them that system doesn't exist for us. You have to get the full thing fully worked out, fully approved, before you can legally start construction. And if you don't do it that way, you could either find yourself getting an enforcement notice from the local authority, or if something went wrong, if someone was hurt or if property were damaged, insurance isn't going to cover you. So there are legal and financial consequences for doing it incorrectly. But it's interesting to hear you say that you're not a fan of the system, because I hear it from people who have lived and worked in England, who have moved to Scotland and now want to do some construction work here, and they're frustrated they can't enact the same system as they have
It's
had
not the system as a whole. It's just one piece that remained after the changes that were imposed by the Building Safety Act, and that one piece, that building notice, is I don't think it should have remained. I think it should have changed in a way. It should have evolved, maybe not completely removed, but evolved in a way to be a bit more defined and aligned with what our role is. Local authority roads, you've got the full plans application, and then the registered building control approvers roads, you've only got one option, which is the submission of an initial notice. And these routes are very, very well used, but the building notice should have either, in my opinion, been omitted or redefined or evolved to align with what the role is and what the regulatory framework is at the moment. That's it.
That is interesting to hear, because up here, like I said, we've had a debate among architects and engineers and contractors and building standards officers and politicians about whether to bring in a private sector approval route into the Scottish system. And there's a lot of disagreement about that. But the one thing we pretty much all agree on is we don't want to bring in that notice system that you have down south. That seems like, I think that's the one thing we all agree on. We can see exactly where that goes wrong.
Well, if you think of it, they bring in building notices or something similar to that. Someone starts on the project, verifier goes out and asks what you plan to do here, and here, or what is going to be done. And then they can't answer the question. They've then got to go to someone like yourself with the skills, knowledge, experience and behaviours to support them what they're trying to achieve. Now it's going to take even longer, because you're going to need to take your time to understand their whole project.
It's going to be a couple of months before I can realistically take it on. And same for structural engineers as well. I can see exactly where this goes wrong.
So do it right firstly.
Yeah. Again, it goes back to what I said earlier. Hire a competent professional at the earliest possible stage, and you're not going to have these issues.
Absolutely. So looking forward, where do we think building regulations will be in 10 years' time?
So one change that's coming down the road for us here in Scotland is what they've called the Passive House equivalent. So if you don't know, Passive House is it's originally a German company, and they've trademarked the name, so the Scottish government can't use Passive House exactly, just euphemistically refer to it as Passive House equivalent. And Passive House is when you design...
Different spelling. They've got house, H-A-U-S.
It's the German spelling of house, H-A-U-S. I do speak a little bit of German. My Deutsch is very schlecht. But it's... the idea being, you build that building. It doesn't have to be a house. You can build any kind of building to Passive House standards, and it should be able to heat itself with minimal energy input. And some people have claimed they built passive homes that they just heat themselves by just walking around inside it and cooking. And that's enough to heat the thing. It's so hyper insulated and so airtight that it's an extremely challenging thing to build. It's a step change from how construction is usually managed. And the Scottish government had the bright idea a few years ago to introduce legislation to change our building regulations to mean that every new home built had to be built to something that they had defined as an equivalent to that. So it became super low energy, super highly efficient homes, which is fine as an aspiration. The trouble is, how do you deliver that in the real world? And they've run into some significant difficulties, one of which is, I've been told off the record, that if you build a passive house and to have it classified as a passive house, you have to hire a qualified architect who's gone through the Passive House course. You then have to have a separate individual who is certified to inspect your Passive House at the end of construction and give you a certificate to say, yes, this meets Passive House standards, and you can declare it as such. They expected local building standards officers to fulfill that second role, to go out and to certify it. And local building standards officers said, we have no training or qualifications or experience in this field. There's no way we can just jump in and do this. It's an enormous task. the number of passive houses built in Scotland, we're talking about a few thousand probably have ever been built. So it's an enormous increase. And for contractors as well, who are building homes, particularly small contractors who might build 1, 2, 3 houses at a time, they don't realize this is coming, and they don't realize how quality control on building sites has to be massively managed. Because if you put membranes on these homes to make them airtight and you pierce that membrane, the whole thing fails, in theory. So getting people to control building sites and to understand how to do this, it's very different from how we currently construct things and how we currently certify things. So they're selling us that in March of 2028, eventually they'll get this thing on the books. And then from everything built after March 2028 is going to have to meet passive house standards. Following that, they're apparently now planning to bring in InnerFit, which is the renovation equivalent of passive house. So that when I start doing house extensions or substantial renovations of old buildings, I'm going to have to bring in some kind of air tightness, hyper insulation, and air handling systems that will, suck air in from the outside and then suck stale air out from inside, which I've done some of this on some of my projects, but it's a massive step change from what we're used to doing. And in some cases, it will raise the cost of construction massively, and there will be failures.
Is there going to be a government grant for any of this, or are they just expecting?
None of that. There is. It's all stick and no carrot. So they're just dictating to us, you will now implement this because we've had a bright idea. And they've in the consultation process for the legislation,
at your own cost.
They've discovered, wait a second, this might go badly wrong. They were meant to bring it in a couple of years ago, and they realized they couldn't do it because the whole construction industry, trades, professionals, and local authority were simply not ready for it. I mean, I'm an architect who's been designing homes all my life. I've only been in a passive house a couple of times. They're very rare. I've never designed one. And now you're telling me I'm going to have to know how to do this as standard. The same for contractors, the same for, the supply chain, the same for the local authorities. It's an enormous task, potentially.
Very difficult.
A friend of mine is a retrofit coordinator and retrofit designer. We've had many conversations, and a lot of contractors still struggling to install EWI. Like that, they're still getting those types of things wrong. To imagine contractors trying to get a passive house scheme done, it's another world.
But yeah, it's the way that you have to go about constructing these things. I mean, I've done behind the scenes research and some amount of training, continuing professional development in this area to build up my own knowledge. And the more I learn, the more I realize I need to learn way more. And if I'm doing that and I've got a professional body behind me, like the Royal Institute of British Architects, the Royal Incorporation of Architects in Scotland, I'm members of both, and they provide training seminars, which are very useful. And I'm sitting there learning this stuff. And then I'm looking at contractors who are not registered. Like, to be a contractor, you can just start tomorrow and say, I'm Bob the Builder. I do construction.
No. You can't start tomorrow. You need to buy a white van first, Neil.
Yeah, no, sorry. Yes, you're absolutely correct. So once you've got your white van, you're set. Yeah. These guys, they can just present themselves as being contractors, and there's no body behind them. There's no training happening or ongoing professional development. They have no clue this is coming down the line. They have nobody lobbying government on their behalf, like I do, and you guys do. Suddenly they'll arrive on a building site and go, that's not how we did the last one. Well, tough, because this is how you're doing everyone from here on out. They will misprice jobs, they will mismanage jobs, and there will be the homeowner will be left holding or paying bills for things that don't actually comply. So there's going to be mistakes if this isn't managed properly. I think there's a bigger conversation to be had about how we go about managing building contractors, and should building contractors be required to be formally registered with some kind of central body so that training can be funneled towards them, so that they can talk to government with a coherent voice, and so that they can be, if they go wrong, if they mismanage someone's project, they can face severe professional disciplinary and consequences, like you or I would if there was a complaint against us. So
we've got a sanction section next to our names on the public register.
Yeah,
there's no place
so
to hide.
I've got the Architects Registration Board that could
carry out that. We could be struck off. We could get a sanction put against our name, but
whereas for a builder, I've seen builders behave atrociously towards people, and mismanaging their finances, mismanaging their projects, doing really truly incompetent things. Sometimes through their own ignorance, they simply didn't know they were going wrong. And others, the small minority who do it deliberately, they set out to deceive. and they're defrauding people, the cowboys. If we brought in some kind of registration scheme, that would help to massively address that. And it would help us to build better.
I'm all for that, to be fair.
Yeah.
I'm all for that. But 2 questions. What concerns you most? What excites you most in the next 10 years?
What concerns me is that we're like the passive house thing. We have governments and people within governments who are somewhat disconnected from the reality of the industry, who are dreaming up nice ideas. They do it in the planning system as well. Over the last 20 years, they've introduced all kinds of environmental requirements, which on paper, it's very hard to argue against. You can't say, to hell with the badgers and the newts and the bats. You sound like a monster saying it. But the net output of this is we're building fewer homes, and the homes we are building cost more money, and it takes longer to get there because the system is just more difficult to get through, because someone in government had a bright idea, or they were lobbied by a special interest group to introduce these things into the system. The passive house is a good example. Nothing in theory wrong with that. It's just we need to accept it's going to raise prices and it's going to take longer to achieve these things. We are overcomplicating a process that is already very complicated, and we are not investing in training and equipping people behind the scenes. It's like the question you asked about, are they giving us grants? They should be. If we're going to go about down the road of making builders get registered, it might be an idea to give a registered builder a tax cut so that, if you employ a registered builder, you're paying slightly less VAT on your project, as an example. That's the kind of joint up thinking governments ought to be doing, but are not. The things that excite me, I think this is probably a broader political or cultural observation, is that we have gone through 40 plus years of neoliberalism and the idea that everything should be privatized and everything should be, the state should shrink as small as possible. I suspect the pendulum is swinging back the other way. I suspect at some point in time, maybe Mr. Burnham, if he becomes prime minister, will enact an idea that maybe the state should have a far larger role in housing, as an example, and that maybe local authorities should start building their housing stock again. They used to, and it was a good idea, and that you could then perhaps have local authorities going to schools and recruiting young people, giving them training as tradespeople, getting them qualified, and having a stock of people who are employed at the local authority level to build and maintain buildings. I think a lot of people out there would have an appetite for that. They'd be willing to accept that will be a step in the right direction, because we've privatized the living daylights out of construction, and it has led us to ever increasing house prices and ever reducing standards of construction. It hasn't really delivered. And I think there's a lot of people who are wedded to that for ideological reasons. And I think there's an appetite in the general public for a more larger involvement of the state. So I'd be interested to see if the state gets involved in building again. I think that's certainly, if people are going to want to talk about it. Whether it happens, I don't know. But that idea of a significant change in how our economy functions and the role of the state within it is potentially interesting. Let's just say it. I don't know if it's exciting. Being chased by a tiger might be exciting, but it's not exactly something I would recommend. Interesting would be a word I'd be more inclined to adhere to that.
Got a quick fire round for you.
Go for
30 seconds max.
Yeah.
Planning permission or building regulations, which is more misunderstood?
The building regs. Definitely.
Next, biggest mistake homeowners make before starting an extension. 30 seconds max.
Not talking to appropriately qualified professionals. They go and talk to their friends who did one, or they go and talk to a local builder, or they're just trying to start doing their own research and start developing a design themselves. If they've had no experience of construction, that's going to end badly. So go and talk to an architect. Find a good local architect who does this kind of stuff, and that's going to serve you well in the long run. It's a good investment.
Most misunderstood exemption.
I try and talk people over permitted development. I think that's if you live in a house that is not in a conservation area and the house is not listed, fine, you have permitted development rights, but it is artificially restricting the size of the building that you could build. You could almost certainly get planning for a larger extension. So provided you can afford it and it works for you, I see people going down the permitted development route and they're still not happy at the end of the day because the structure they have constructed isn't actually big enough for the use they want to put their house to. But they did it just to avoid going through the planning system. And that's a false.
One regulation requirement that surprises clients the most.
Oh, there's any number. There's the amount of glazing you can have in your extension. minimum door widths. People think, oh, you just they grow up in a house that has very narrow doors and think that's perfectly fine. And then you tell them, actually, the door has to be of a certain width.
Okay.
And that means the corridor has to be a certain width. And they're like, oh, right. And bathroom, it's different in Scotland than it is in England. But we have activity spaces, for the size of space you can have in a bathroom, or the minimum sizes. And people are thinking, my God, that's actually quite large. The Scottish one is bigger than the English one, I'm fairly sure, for the principal sanitary accommodation. But yeah, telling people there are minimum sizes for things, and then explaining to them by marking out on a floor using masking tape. I love doing that. This is the minimum size you have to have for this thing. And their eyes pop.
Best advice you've ever received as an architect?
You're assuming I received good advice as an architect.
Well, we hope so.
I don't know. That's a really good question. I suspect best advice I received as an architect.
You must have had one. Yeah?
I've had lots of older architects that I was very fortunate to work with as a young graduate, and people who took me aside and explained how the system worked and made sure that my training covered everything it needed to cover. They didn't have to do that. So it's not so much advice as such a single thing. It's just that I feel slightly guilty in that being self-employed and never having had staff of my own, I've never been able to pay that one forward or pay it back, whatever it is. That when I was younger, a lot of older architects took an interest in me and in my career and made sure that I understood as much as I had to understand. And I didn't realize how important it was at the time. It's only latterly looking back at it. They didn't have to do this, but they massively helped my career, helped me as a professional. So it's not so much that I received a single piece of advice that was useful. It's that people were good at making sure I understood things. And I think part of why I set up real life architecture is for me to be able to explain the reality of what it is I do, because the average media portrayal of an architect is not in the least bit accurate. So I'm trying to do my bit for my profession by explaining the broad scope of things we do and the complexity of it and how long it takes.
I have
know
one
that's not the answer.
question. Is there anything you think that you would like to ask us on behalf of homeowners or clients, which you think they could find beneficial? So if anyone listening, is there anything where we can answer something for you, which it seems to be a common misunderstanding?
Yeah. I mean, for you guys, correct me if I'm wrong. If let's just say, like, I get people asking me for just advice, it's never going to go beyond just advice. I'm not going to be commissioned to design their project because it's the other end of the country. Do you or do other of your colleagues provide a service like that? So if a homeowner is needing some kind of clarity on the building regulations, they just want to understand a point in it, is there somewhere they can go? Can they talk to you guys, or is there someone else in your profession that can just get quick answers to complex problems, or do they have to go through the actual building regulations application process? Is there anyone out there who does kind of what I'm doing, but from a building regs point of view?
That would be the principal designer, wouldn't it?
They can speak directly to RBIs, but
because we used to be able to, as architects, I used to be able to do this with local authorities. They used to have a help desk, and that's kind of gone through cost cutting, etc., and austerity. But I used to be able to walk into, say, Edinburgh City Council with a set of preliminary drawings and ask to speak to a building standards officer, sit down, and they would clarify things for me. So that there's a lot to this that I didn't understand, and they would help and advise, and they don't do that anymore. Unless I might know some of the officers personally. I have their mobile numbers. I might be able to ask them, but it's a favor that I'm asking. It's not a formal service. So it's useful for architects to be able to ask you guys these things too, because the regs are massively complex, and I quite often need clarity.
There is way to access independent RBIs that they've got their own setup and they've got their own insurance that covers them for consultancy work. And there are building regulation consultancy organizations out there in England as well. If you've got a bigger project that would require like the input of maybe a former RBI or someone that is very knowledgeable in the building regulations. But you can also get access to independent RBIs that are offering consultancy consultancy services, but obviously they do understand that they cannot act as the RBI on this application if it goes to a building control application process. They cannot act as the RBI on it if they give any design or consultancy advice for it. But you can have access to those, and there are platforms, and obviously even if you type on Google building regulation consultancy, there are quite a few firms that have set up just specifically for that.
Okay. Because that would be helpful. I mean, it may not be something the average homeowner would think to use, but certainly as an architect, I would benefit from that, being able to just ask clarifying questions on various points in building regulations.
We can't give design advice. We can discuss technical matters and discuss the building regulations with you, but we couldn't tell you what to do or how to achieve it. Otherwise,
I don't need that. It's just understanding. Having more context quite often. But where I would need this would be prior to very early in the design process. And sometimes the way I get around it sometimes is I just talk to another architect. I'm involved with a group of other sole practitioner architects in the Edinburgh area, and we bounce ideas off of each other. Most of us work alone. So if you encounter an issue that you don't fully understand, you can't easily get the information, and it's far ahead of when you would have launched your building regs application. So
like I said, you can definitely speak to an independent RBI or even an RBI working within a building regulation consultancy organization, but this has to be outside a formal building control application.
And that's what I would want, because if it did require
they cannot act as the formal RBI on the application in the future at all, because that would be not within their remit.
No, I just understood that. It could just be that if I want something confirmed, or even just a sort of a review of decisions I had made to date prior to me, say, going through the planning system, because I don't want to get planning for something that then I later on have to turn around and completely change because it doesn't comply with building regulations. So that very early stage discussion could be very, very valuable.
Brilliant. Níall, this has been a brilliant conversation, because we've managed to cover some things that affects almost everyone who undertakes a building project at some point in their lives. So thank you very much for giving us your time today.
Yeah, hopefully with the conversation we've had, we've bridged a bit of a gap between homeowners, architects, and building control. And, it can be confusing, but if you get the right people engaged early on, things can run quite seamlessly if they manage properly.
Yeah.
Níall, if people want to follow your work, your videos, and your content, where can they find you?
So I'm on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram under the username Real Life Architecture. If you just type that into any of those three social medias, I will pop up. I also have a website, reallifearchitecture.co.uk. It has all of my details in there, including information on how to book an online consultation. And whether you're a homeowner, home buyer, or you're looking at a plot of land or whatever it might be, if you need my advice, you can book a consultation on there and have me discuss what it is you want to do. I can look at your timescales, your plans, your budget. If you're looking to buy a house or alter the house you've got, all I need is just the photographs and floor plans, and an estate agent's online listing is ideal for that, because they usually have a basic floor plan. That's enough to get started with. It doesn't need to be complex. All the details are on there. And if anyone is going to book a consultation, please read the terms and conditions before you do so.
Thank you very much, Níall. Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Yes, likewise.
Cheers. Thanks, Níall.
This episode of Behind the Regs is sponsored by Plan Checker. Plan Checker is a UK-based digital platform designed to connect clients with verified building control and construction professionals, making it easier to find the right expertise at the right time for the right job. It doesn't replace building control bodies, and it doesn't carry out restricted activities or function. It simply creates clearer, more transparent access to the professionals working across the industry. If you're a professional, a client, or part of the wider built environment sector, you can learn more or sign up at planchecker.co.uk.